Welcome to Take One Whiteboard, where we are capturing in-the-moment conversations with thought leaders on practical solutions towards getting better results. Take one means it is literally one take, unrehearsed and spontaneous. Participants trust the energy of the moment and feel free to explore and share their thinking, often in rapid exchanges with layering of ideas. This can feel unconventional, but the resulting discoveries are candid and honest. We do our best to leave it unedited. I am Stuart Morse, and thanks for tuning in. So welcome here today, back to another version of our videos, and we're here with Greg Ames. So, Greg, tell us about Greg Ames.
Tell us about Greg Ames. Well, Stu, thanks first for having me and taking the time to talk to me. I guess in the context of what we've been talking about with respect to what you want to do here, my background in innovation and innovation strategy and new product development. Been doing it a long time, about 33 years, consumer products, industrial products. And
so a broad background.
Broad background, sort of a generalist, in terms of engineering and industrial design, consumer research, strategy. So
I've known Greg a long time, and it's been fun to watch his journey. And so insanely curious to have you here and have this discussion. So what's on the top of your mind, or what do you see as something that you're thinking about right now with leaders?
Yeah, with innovation and strategy, I guess as I've been working through a point of view on where we are with innovation, right? And how do we teach it, and how do we develop it, and how do we help leaders lead? We've kind of lost track, I think, of sort of the simple ways of thinking about what it is and how to do it. There's been a lot of really good work on methodology and best practices, but I think it helps, when I start this conversation with people, is to kind of go back to some really fundamental, foundational building blocks. So I guess the first thing I want to offer up is a definition of innovation.
Absolutely.
So if you get on the internet and you look up innovation definition,
it's like Kleenex.
Right. there's thousands of them,
right.
All kinds of them, and everybody's
it's
trying.
Become a scary word for people. It's like, oh.
Well,
I want to interrupt you. So go ahead with your definition.
That's a good point. It's also, I think, it's sort of lost its focus. I think simplicity will help people with the disciplines around how to do it.
Excellent.
So really, like a simple way that I've used to talk to people about it is innovation is increase value on purpose.
Well, that would speak to leaders.
And and this is the verb of innovation, like the noun of innovation. And what I mean by that is people will assign qualities to innovation. It's creative, it's esoteric, it's breakthrough, right? But the action of innovation is about increasing value on purpose. Again, simple definition. The other reason I like this definition is because it invites everybody into the conversation. Innovation is not beholden to the engineer or the marketer or the designer.
It's for everyone.
Everybody in the organization has the opportunity to increase value on purpose.
Yeah, that's their job, right?
Right. And if you can unpack this a little bit, so what does it mean to increase value? So increasing value means there's some who,
right,
and there's some need or want they have, and they have some sense of worth around what they need and how much it's worth to them, right? So and we can get into this later, but more of a transaction is eventually going to be in there.
Well, that's your worth piece. That's the value.
That's the value.
Is that the value?
Right.
If I heard you correctly.
And value, and that depends. The metrics you'd use for worth depends on the who. It could be money, it could be time, it could be quality of life, it could be efficiency.
So when you bring this over, that's a broad context of what, depending on it.
Value depends on the person that you're trying to serve in innovation.
Right.
It's not your value, it's their value.
Right.
Now there is another value. This is the value for the who, and then there's also a value of the innovation to us, right? I know this is a little bit messy, but go with me on it a little bit.
That's called whiteboarding.
It's whiteboarding, yeah. So innovation for the sake of coming up with something that's increasing value for somebody else, there needs to be a transaction. Now, that doesn't mean it's money. You might work on a not-for-profit. You might get value back because of something. Teachers, I like to teach. Some of the value I get back from that process is seeing transformation in other people.
So use the word transaction. So part of this value on purpose is to have value, there needs to be a transaction.
The value flow, right.
Okay, value flow back and forth.
Back and forth, right. Now the other part of this too that's really important is on purpose. And I guess there's two ways to think about on purpose. On purpose, again, these seem like really simple ideas, but I've seen that this isn't practiced as much as I think it could be, which is what's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? As an entity that's trying to do innovation, are you trying to double your business? Are you trying to, solve a problem in society?
Do you think part of this complexity around innovation, we've lost sight of the simplicity of that?
This is simple, but it's hard to do.
Right.
Because you have to get in touch with why you exist. What's your
reason? You got to get in touch with
that. And why do you exist as an entity to do innovation in the first place? I mean, so this is a process, and again, you can prototype your way through that. You can try different goals on. You can evaluate them. You and I talked earlier about the importance of culture and readiness, and we'll actually get more into that in a little bit later. The other part of purpose is how are you doing this deliberately? And this is all about your work process, right. Idea management, stage gate, right, capability. So are you doing it with best practices, tools, methods, and so on and so forth? And then the other thing that was really important that came out of our conversation this morning is to be deliberate about culture, which is what you do so much of, right? So to touch that right now,
this is all this. I mean, we like to use the word holistic, but it's really this. It's not just about doing this. It's
right.
about being aware.
Being aware, and as you and I talked this morning. This is also about being ready to do this. Like institutions, well, everybody wants to innovate now, right? And like, who doesn't want to do innovation? If it doesn't show up in your report someplace, it means But are you prepared for the journey from a cultural standpoint?
Does that relate into mindset?
I think so. Mindset and as you
like a readiness mindset.
A readiness to do it, and an appreciation of what must be true in the culture for you to eat. Because these are the mechanics.
Right.
This is like, okay, we're going to define our who, we're going to go after the needs and wants and the worth to them. How do you drive a transaction between us and them? What's the value to us in return? Setting up goals, measures, right. Standards of progress.
And so now it's falling into a process.
A process doesn't necessarily have to be linear.
Exactly.
It could be recursive and iterative.
And so is that where this starts to play in?
But this is the part that I've seen overlooked a lot, which is the culture. How is a culture going to enable or disable? You used yin and yang earlier, right? There's sort of the mechanics, and then there's the culture.
Right.
And if you don't have the culture in place or know what the journey is that you're going to get onto with respect to this work and how it affects the status quo, then you could be setting yourself up for
So in your career, how have you seen this play out? Both in a where you've seen it constrain. I mean, you put two arrows here about how it can enable the culture, but how the culture can also constrain.
Well, I don't want to go dark with that,
right.
Because there's unfortunately some negative ways to talk about it. But I think, for example, it's a much more productive conversation. Let me think about this for a second. It's very important to make these things explicit to the culture so they can understand it, right. And you can begin to socialize it. What are we trying to double our business in 5 years? Where to play, how to win, strategy things, and we can talk more about that later. And what's our prospect? Again, the whole consumer model, the whole business model, value to us. But how do you socialize that? and actually use that almost to the point where you actually prototype a future scenario for your business. So some of the stuff I've done before and been involved in is we've imagined the future state of a brand, and we build it. Storefronts and in-home experiences, it's experiential prototyping. Like you manifest a future reality, you bring it to life. What does our brand look like in 2025? And then you get the culture to respond to that possible reality, and it helps elicit three types of people. You get one type of person, or one cohort, if you will, that is drawn to it, they're excited, they don't know necessarily how they're going to get there, but they're excited about it. There's another group of people that aren't sure how to think about it. They don't know whether they like it or don't. They could just be confused by it, because not everybody kind of gets that, and for different reasons. There's a third group of people that get entrenched in the way we do things. And I think one of the mistakes that I've made in my career is by brute force, I was going to get these people
to force those to come
to
along
influence those people along. And sometimes that works, but I think a more productive approach is to honor it and then work from it.
Not force, but honor.
But that's a real leadership challenge, and I think at that point, and so for instance, if you've got a business that's always sold hammers, and the brand figured out that it had a better idea for pliers or a screwdriver, but the back room, there's people that say, wait, we just make hammers, and we've only ever made hammers, and we don't know how to make screwdrivers. So you tell them how we would get to making screwdrivers. At some point, those people need to come along or you're going to get stuck. But it's how you actually get after that part of that and that influence. That's a
so
very
is it to be aware of it? Be aware of it, conscious of it?
At least start there.
At least start right there.
Because and I would say, all of this stuff, and I saw Bill's really good video on the strategy work. There are people that are really good at building out these mechanics. And there's people that do a lot of work like you on culture. I think the thing about this is to understand that this is a difficult thing. It's hard. Just accept the fact that that's going to be a hard thing to do, which is reconcile to get the culture and the strategy into coherence with each other.
Yeah, and we usually, as we talk, we usually draw that these, this is strategy and culture in there.
Right. They're braided.
And the more they're braided, as we've talked, it's this DNA strand but you're going for momentum.
Right.
It's
right.
I'm going to drag this thing along, but can you build up momentum? Can you get this thing to start pulling itself along?
Well, and here's the paradox, right? If you're doing this work well, and your process of innovation involves some fairly provocative ways of thinking about your enterprise or your brand or your product or your suite of offerings, you're going to have uneasiness. If you get 90% buy-in to the strategy that you have to double your business in 5 years, if that's a goal, probably not reaching far enough, right? Or
you're actually wanting. If I hear you correctly, you're wanting to create tension here.
You do. You want to create tension.
Because if you don't have tension there, who are you then?
Right.
I mean,
right.
What are we pulling on?
Right. And some big companies will build tension into their system on purpose for that purpose, but they'll actually operationalize it. So a big company I used to work for in consumer products it's a constant tension between like engineering and design, R&D and marketing. And that is an intentional construct to get to a better place.
Well, and if you manage it,
right.
It can be a healthy tension.
Right.
If you're unaware of it and you're not honoring it, it can
right. This is one of the things.
Blindside you, flank you.
It's hard to do. It's hard to do. So I guess if I had to roll all this up, it would be around the fact, again, back to innovation, increase value on purpose. Value depends on who you're doing this for, what the nature of value is to them, what's the nature of value to us. And just get really clear about that. On purpose is what are your goals, what's your intent, your purpose, and on purpose is deliberate best practices and work process.
So you see the intent, clarity.
Right. And the thing that is sort of overlooked is, and again, there's two sides of a coin, or the yin and yang, is that the cultural influence on you could have all the best intentions, best practice, good capability, bring in a great team, but if the bedrock culture can hold you back, you can spend a lot of time not making a lot of progress, and a lot of pain too. It's not even the speed of progress, but it's other things that can happen in the culture because of the disharmony, you know. So honor it, and then I think the solutions, it's the kind of stuff that you do, which how do you get in there and actually, you know, help with that process.
So from these pieces, and you've said this is difficult, so, and we're trying to get to something that leaders can get their head around. How would you, and you've just, I like the way you've just,
I think it's the
define
clarity
this out.
of the challenge, because I do have a lot of confidence in leaders if they understand that this is a challenge for them. And to go into it with a sense of vulnerability that this could lead into places that you haven't had to deal with before. This is change management, it really is what it is. But it happens in innovation. Because man, who wouldn't want to sign up for a double your business in 5-year goal? If you're an employee, yeah, of course we want that. But if it means we got to start doing things differently.
how does the concept of piloting fit into this?
It's a great point. That's a way, piloting, prototyping, low resolution prototyping, and I was going to maybe get into this differently later, but it's the idea that how can you go through this process, make things real at the lowest resolution possible, as easy as possible, to test the culture's ability to pick it up, run with it, adapt it, play with it, manipulate it, so it's not precious. So, for example, you want a low resolution prototype, like if you wanted to get into the plier business in your hammer company, let's put together some examples, you know, sketches, drawings, bring some, you know, some pliers in and say, what if we did this, and sort of build it out with our brand. What does it look like to elicit this conversation?
So you're kind of testing this.
You're testing
the
it
water
out
with this while you're doing the idea.
While you're doing the idea, while you're evaluating.
So it's not about
it.
just go off and go in a lab somewhere, do this, and come back and go, okay, we're now making this.
Right. Because if you can show people where it's headed, you might pick up some of these people down here to say, okay, I get it, that's what you mean. I didn't know what you meant by pliers for our hammer company.
So does that fall, do you also pull from ideas from those people when they see that? I mean,
Absolutely.
So it's this like open ideation process?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and one of the things you and I talked earlier is to get into a conversation about, okay, if that's our future, how do you solicit input from the organization on two fronts? I guess this could be a tool. I hadn't thought of this until we started talking, is ask the organization what must be true. Okay, so if Acme wants to get into they're a hammer company, they want to get a plier business, and there's hesitation in the organization, go through a systematic process of asking if there's hesitation in the culture. So, okay, we're saying that there's some concern about this. Okay, help us understand, and the other question is, why will it fail?
Right, we were talking about that earlier. I think that's an interesting concept.
You know, and this is sort of the assumption set that's more positive, and this is sort of the failure modes about why it will fail. But use those questions to get to the details around why the legacy system or the incumbent system feels like we can't do pliers. Well, we can't, we don't know
so
how.
I like where you're going with this idea that's positive and negative, and play with their perceptions
Right.
around their
Because there's really legitimate
excitement
stuff.
or their resistance.
Let's say all your engineers were
Yeah.
hammer engineers, and now you're going
So
to
we don't have the capability to design.
Well, am I going to lose my job? Are you going to hire people to replace me? Now do pliers? How are you going to deal with that change for me? Because oh, by the way, my portfolio hasn't gotten any smaller on the list of things I got to get done, but now I got to do it on things I haven't done before. I don't know what I'm getting into. The regulatory guys say, wait, there's a whole bunch of regulatory standards around pliers.
So what must be true? Why
Whatever
will
that
it
is.
fail?
Right. Right.
Excellent question.
So these are questions you can ask all the way through the process, and should ask all the way through the process to make sure. And part of the reason for that is to figure out what's the most important question that right now could throw this thing off the rails. Right. So you're into a new idea. And which kind of brings up another. So you set this aside.
So start to expand on some of those things that you'd like to expand this out with some things that you're thinking about.
So let's say that. So this is all about sort of defining innovation, the cultural and sort of mechanical relationship, right? And how those are sort of a yin and yang, and they're always moving alongside of each other. They're not linear, right? You're always going through your cycle here on strategy and culture, right? Or method and mechanics and culture. The other thing is to think about when you get to the level of, okay, let's say you want to innovate and everybody's bought into it, or you're trying to get started on it, because this is all parallel processes. Where does innovate, what's the genesis of innovation? So if somebody says, okay, I want to double my business in 5 years, which is one of my favorite go-tos, because a lot of people say that, right? Where do you start? Well, an idea can start from a market need, which is a pull. It can be a tech push. You know, you have a technology like a chip, and you want to figure out what to do with that chip. You have a strategy, which is identified, you know, where to play. And I can't read this, but and then the other one that's sort of come up recently for me, it's
so you had where to play, and what's the second one?
Oh, how to win.
How to win.
Where to play, how to win.
Very good.
You know, so you've identified areas of focus, and you've got an aspiration in there. You want to double your business. You've identified prospects. You've identified focus consumer markets, customer markets. Tech push is I have something. I got like flubber, and I want to figure out how I can sell lots of flubber. Market pull is sort of the market you're in.
Someone
right
just
now.
asked us to do something different, or
Yeah, and markets is like, there's a demand. The other one that's kind of interesting to me is that I've just been sort of wrapping my head around a little bit. It's sort of starting with your orthodoxies. And this is terminology that Doblin uses, really like some of their work around understanding some of the nuances, hard points and soft points about what defines your business. So go back to Acme for a second. You could go through a pretty analytical process of saying, we know how to make a hammer, how to put wood into metal, how to, okay, there's sort of an analytical way of saying, what are we good at, right? We're good at hardware stores. We're good at, selling to hardware and all that. But what else is going on in the back room? And this gets into the culture thing. So what is it about our culture that we're good at? And maybe the things that we're not so good at. And starting from a position of, and this is kind of a qualitative process, but I think that there's some methods that we could talk about how do you understand who you are, and therefore what could you go off and do with that?
So some people will call that, I've heard in the industry, like a capabilities driven.
Capability plus culture.
Plus culture. Okay.
So, and it really depends a lot too, and this is part of the prototyping
capabilities plus culture.
Of culture and how you would frame those things. Because even the terminology you use to define who you are and what you do can affect the way you think about how you would leverage that. Are you in the paper towel business as a paper towel? Are you in the cleaning up spill business? Or are you in the business of providing harmony in the kitchen?
Right.
Because paper towels clean up messes and restore relationships.
And you happen to just have been working with a paper towel.
Right.
And you could shift to somewhere else within harmony.
Or is tech in the business of telecommunications, or is it in the business of providing access to media? Right? So, or whatever, all those models that have been so highly explored. So it's understanding who you are, and then how could you build that out to address these things. So market demand, pretty boilerplate, tech push. By the way, this is hard to do well, and I think, again, Bill talked about some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Strategy driven, and then this other thing, which is sort of this mashup of orthodoxies, which gets at the soft and hard points about where could we look, that because of the things we're good at or the things we're not. And by the way, this is a lot of self-awareness here. Like, you kind of have to know thyself.
So it's very interesting to listen to you talk, because you're reframing innovation as I listen to you. This idea of it has fallen to this, it's a complex thing, we need to do this, it's a process, this, and you're pulling back and saying it's actually a broader, big picture view tied to this value on purpose.
It's funny because none of these sketches they look complex because I'm speeding through the sketches, but it's really innovation, value on purpose,
Make it simple.
mechanics, and understand your culture and your orthodoxies. Challenge yourself across the process. Know what your assumptions are. That's part one. Part two is sort of, where do I start?
Well, I love this conversation we had earlier today, this why will it fail? You know, you hear fail fast, but no, I'm going to question
Right.
its failure. What's its failure? Let me, and I was framing it as this, give us the total risk avoidance thing. I mean, this whole thing we want to avoid. And your comment was, if you start to approach that, what does that tell you about the environment, your competition?
Well, and I'll build on this too. One of the things you've asked me, some of my experience in this, what can happen, especially in, I guess, larger institutions with a pretty mature innovation organization, in that it always seems like there's 100 things you could do at any point in time on a project, an initiative, or a program. But what are the one or two things that if you don't do those right, the other 98 don't matter? You know, so like, what do we got to answer right now? Back to the idea of prototype.
And what does that tell you by going through that process linked to innovation? What else does that valuable information does that give you?
You mean that process of testing or the process
This process
of
of around failure.
I think what it does, well, I think the process of having this discipline around answering what must be true, why will it fail, is it focuses work, minimizes the amount of resources you may need at any point in time in the process, and allows the resources that are working on those other 98 things to go off and do something else, right? And I think and again, it's not as easy as it sounds, because sometimes you need some of those 98 other things to happen because it's going to affect the progress over the next hill after that. You have to anticipate. You can't take every issue as it comes. But usually, you can get well into a project and you've got a great idea, you've got a technical right to succeed, you've got the brand and a brand strategy that makes sense, but nobody's thought about how are we going to make money on this? Well, we'll figure that out when we get there, or when we launch it, or when we actually pilot it.
Meaning,
what's the business
if I heard
model?
you correctly, that's what I was about to ask.
What's the business model? And
So when in this process do you bring in the business model?
Right away. And I think
because is that addressed? Did I follow you correctly? That business model is in
absolutely
in these pieces.
Yeah.
Too?
In fact, I probably should have gone to that.
So where does business model fit in your drawings?
So again, let me just recap. Definition, the elements, genesis, where can it start? Let me just tie this one off. All these things need to be true eventually, right? So you need to make sure you've got a market need, you've got a technology, you've got a strategy, and it fits with your orthodoxies. You can start anywhere.
Right. Okay.
But you eventually have to evaluate these, and it's the same answer for this to the components of an idea, is you need to have your who, and this is really shorthand, value prop, business model, and a right to win and to sustain a competitive advantage. And this is one of these things that, again, I was thinking about how to make this all simpler. These are hard questions to answer. But if you can answer those 4 questions, you probably have a pretty good proposition. And so you asked about when do you answer the model. You should always be, let's say you and I are on a napkin. But, and there's a time and a place for evaluation and critique, right? But things we ought to be asking about, who this idea would be for this person. This is our idea, our offering.
So it's organic it's almost like the moment will call on these. Just make sure
as long as you're disciplined about it.
As long as you're disciplined, that you hit all 4, that you can pull on these in an organic manner.
Yes, and the reason it's important to kind of always be cycling through this. So the way
I could see this having an impact on which ones you pull on and in what order.
Well, think about it.
Oh, I've done drawing like that. That's interesting.
Right. So you're moving up through the process, and you're always, and maybe it's getting onto tighter circles because you're getting more definition and better resolution. The reason you want to, it's like, I got a great idea for a new app for this person to do this and such thing. How are we going to make money? Don't know. Like, well, let's talk about that.
Just
This can reinform the proposition.
just vet it for a moment.
It's not the reason you might kill the idea. It actually could help inform how to do a more robust.
And I could see listening to you, I could see, even if I answer that, I don't know, that's okay.
Right. But know that you don't know.
Know that you don't know, and know that at some point we're going to need to know that.
Right. Now, as leaders, I would say as leaders and leaders in organizations, and again, there's a right tone of voice to do this. There's a right time and a place to be critiqued and evaluate. Honor it. Know the culture. Right. If you're walking into an ideation session, don't hit them with a bunch of things. When there's 50 ideas on the wall, don't hit them with a bunch of why will it fail.
So how important is it?
But know, you're going through critical reviews of programs for resourcing. You're moving through your stage gate process. You better make sure there's a who, value prop, business model, and a right to succeed.
So how important is the listening?
Or at least a hypothesis that you can test.
Okay.
Share the risk. Can we keep going? No, don't go until you answer this a little better, right? So, but the other reason why this is so powerful is it makes everything transparent. One of the things that really drives leadership crazy is that they don't understand what's going on. Leadership wants to, in my experience, good leadership, this is a hope for leaders that might listen to this, is they participate in the problem solving. They want to know the risks. They're involved in the discussion to the extent that they can add value.
Well, you've made a couple of comments, especially I'm thinking around leaders. You had commented, this is a leadership challenge, is to manage this,
right?
To coach it along, to care for it. I was thinking of, what kind of listening skills do leaders need through this?
Listening and discernment, because I like the listening point, but it's the ability to discern.
Interesting. Okay.
Where, how effectively have we defined and vetted and socialized our innovation strategy by answering these questions about value and intent, and knowing when to listen to get feedback and when to listen and say, understood, but we're going to go do this. And that's a dilemma that some of the most senior leadership has to deal with. There's no hard and fast rule about when do you make the call that, okay, I understand there's 15% dissent in my organization around a strategy, but we're going to go do this, right?
Right.
So it's that proactive and effective listening that you understand, but you still got to make a call. I think one of the worst things that's happened with innovation over the years is this notion of consensus, which leads to compromise. It sort of tends, everybody's happy and the whole thing gets sort of like this, right? And as opposed to the idea of alignment, where inputs are heard, but there's an empowered leader to make a decision.
When you say that, makes me think of this tension. If I go to consensus and everybody's excited, I've lost this tension. So part of moving on something is to retain that tension.
Right. Steve Jobs, Apple, right? He was a very strong leader, directed a lot of the design and of the work. It had a very strong point of view, and not everything goes very well if
right.
You get the wrong kind of leader or the lack of brilliance on that. But that's another thing that I would put into this mix someplace, and it sort of runs through all of it, which is how effective is your decision-making process. One of the biggest things that I've seen get in the way of innovation right now, or at least reduce its productivity, is the ambiguous decision-making. Who's going to make the call based on what criteria, and when are they going to make it? And teams can go sideways and stall.
So that's part of this clarity.
Clarity, right?
Yeah. Around decisions too.
But because, and this takes me to another place that we probably don't have time to get into, but the difference between a role and responsibility. We tend to lump roles and responsibility together. You may have a role on a project. I don't think people get into difficulty when they're working on parallel roles or adjacent roles. What they get into trouble on, what teams get in trouble on, is they don't know who's going to make the call, who's going to be accountable. Because if you don't declare it, then everybody feels like they might be. And then everybody's going to be responsible for the outcome. Declare the accountable leader who's going to assimilate, make calls, get alignment, not consensus.
So we in our model, we haven't, we have this idea of socket. See it, own it, create within it. And what makes me think of this is make sure you understand where the ownership lies. So, because when you start creating, this is going to drive. If there's alignment, if there's not alignment there, you can go all over the place. When you're creating, you never know when to stop. When are the constraints? You say, no, done with this one, move on. Done with this one, move on. This could just run rampant. And I like your view of this goes down the consensus. It's got to be. I wrote it down: movement versus consensus.
Yeah, and we all do it too. I mean, when I've been part of a team that's had consensus, I've contributed to the compromise of that. I know I have, right? And the compromise I might have could be around the level of risk the team wants to take. Because I tend to be, the bigger idea guy or the, make it better guy, and then the engineering team would have to figure out, we got to make this with a lot of reliability. So the compromise not being the quality of what I would think would be quality, the compromise not it being, we're going to increase our chance of not being able to run this bottle on a.
So that makes me. Does that fit into this one? I mean, I thought this one was really interesting when you started wrapping this around this right to win and sustain.
Well, I'll tell you
how does that play into what the engineer is? What your comment on the engineers? How am I actually?
Everybody's got a different. That's a good question. I think everybody's got a different lens into what quality of execution looks like. So the brand identity person will be thinking about how effectively does my visual identity as a brand communicate to the consumer about what the brand is, what it's for, why I need them. The engineer's view of right to win and be successful could be, I got to run this with amazing reliability. No downtime, no rework,
right.
No upsets. The regulatory.
Well, they're going there. The focus, this idea of you're going to ask me to do this as an engineer. I have to figure out how to keep this thing from failing.
Well, and there's all kinds of other things that happen. So think about it this way too. Think about everybody in the orchestra. I mentioned regulatory a few times. They got to worry about liability. You've got the brand manager that's worried about hitting the numbers in an 18-month time horizon. And the R&D guys are thinking, well, we're going to work on this it's a 5-year program. This guy's going to be off his job, the marketing guy, long before that 5-year R&D program's over. So
I'm going to be caught. The ownership is going to transfer.
Right.
The ownership's going to transfer to the engineer. So the engineer or the it's going to transfer from R&D.
The leader's going to change, and then projects like that can tend to sort of wither because nobody ever feels like they're, But having said all that too, I think though the empathy, which is another word in here, which is to understand that each of the people involved in this question are coming from a different vantage point on it. And as a leader, these aren't problems or puzzles, they're dilemmas. The difference, a dilemma is sort of an unsolvable problem. There's no specific answer you can box in. You're always weighing off speed, quality, compromise, frustrating somebody, not frustrating somebody. And that's why if I knew that, I might be in that position. Those are very difficult roles to be in.
So a lot of.
But I would say that the ingredient is self-awareness and listening, and at least understanding the nature of the tensions involved is a great first step.
Right. How does two words keep popping? Just popped in my head when I put self-awareness down here with leaders. But this idea of innovation, going back to innovation, if I heard you correctly, and I'm going to frame this way and get your responses, is it's not prescriptive, it's adaptive. So I can give you it's this balance between, I'll give you a construct, but it's all about adapting it to
right.
who you are and on your journey. I just can't come in and say, we're going to run innovation in here. It's about leaders.
You gotta
it's
make
about
it your
culture.
own. You gotta make it your own.
So it's got to be. So, what's that balance between prescriptive and adaptive?
I might use a different word than prescriptive.
Okay.
Which would be code.
Code.
and that's one of the things that you know.
I mean that you don't want it to be, or
there's been a tendency over the past, I don't know, 5 to 10 years that I've seen is organizations want to develop, they want to codify best practices, and there's a good reason for that, is they want to be able to deploy them, especially big companies. How do we do stage gate? We're all going to do stage gate the same way. How do we do brand strategy? I'm talking about one of my previous employers. We're all going to do brand strategy the same way. So there's not a learning curve every time somebody's got to come in and out. And also it allows for apples and apples comparison.
now you get the manual out,
Right.
follow the manual.
Yeah, the problem with that is you can see, it's, you know, some of these things aren't square pegs and square holes. And you know, maybe they should be evaluated differently. Maybe there's a different set of criteria.
Well, especially what you stood up right here in this journey.
Right.
I mean, this is, you have these pieces. It's not just ones and zeros. I mean, when you see code, I hear ones and zeros, plug it in.
See,
hit
and
the
that's going all the way back to where I started. The thing, and again, this, you know, these sketches ended up being anything but, they're simpler than they look.
button. They make sense to me.
But the idea that innovation, and I'm doing this as much for myself as anything here in this conversation, is what's a simple definition of what the verb of innovation is? Increase your value and do it intentionally. It's not whimsical, right?
Right.
So, you know, again, the value is defined by the person that you're trying to serve and the value you need back. Transaction. On purpose, what's your goal? And what are your best practices around this? What I see a lot now happen is there's a lot of discussion and dialogue around methodology. Like if you get on LinkedIn and everybody is proposing that they have a new way to think about it, you know, rehash and rehash and rehash. And what happens is organizations start to lock in, you know, and I would say that's code. Like, okay, we're going to try a different methodology. We're going to try a different tool. We're going to try a different approach. Instead of just saying, okay, let's start with a question. Because every time you start this process, you may actually need to invent your
And
approach.
see how the culture responds to it and get the, I mean,
Right.
it is what you've
That's
described.
a really good point, because the approach you would use to go
Well, this
through-
tells you how this thing's going to manifest
Because
itself and stand up.
I hadn't thought of that until you brought that up. But what can happen is if you're trying to deploy an innovation goal and vision and strategy into an organization that hasn't done it before, and then you come with, and oh, by the way, here's the code we're going to use to follow it. You might not have joined them up into the goal, and then you further alienated or distanced themselves from the process, because now you're introducing...
You're putting too much tension on this.
Well, you're putting code in there, like, okay, what does that mean? What's a concept? You know, what's a narrative? What's a brand strategy framework? What? And then
Why this code
and then they
instead
gotta
of
learn
the other
that.
code?
Right. So
Right.
if there's a way for the organization to own its best practices, informed by what's good in the industry, but how do you make it your own, right? And so I think it's, you know, the leadership challenge again is to make that, you know, allow for flex where you can and have hard points where you can't. Be prepared to make the call. Back over here again is understanding where the ideas can start, but know that these all eventually have to work together. Every innovation's got to answer who, value prop, business model, right to succeed. I would submit that beyond that, you could almost find anything else would fit into one of those categories.
Right.
And if you're not doing work that relates to the goal, right, or the value or the strategy or genesis of ideas or answering the critical questions, as a leader, that's one way to evaluate the productivity of your organization, is the work you see getting done being applied to some of these critical issues. And if it's not, to evaluate why that would be. You should be able to tie the work back to you're doing to what's the value that's being created. I should mention too, Stu, I forgot that we kind of got into the track of new business, new revenue, growth. But remember, we talked about earlier, is this could be for a current business, somebody that manages paper.
It could be internal.
It could be the way that you handle an accounting process.
Yes.
So, but the same things apply. What's the nature of value?
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, that while you were saying that, I was thinking about that the value on purpose is, I could just look at my job and see how I could do that
Better.
better.
Right.
You stood up even though the drawings are full, I like the simplicity of how you just described these three basic areas. But I also, what I heard what you were saying is, I keep focusing on these two questions, and what the constructs you started putting around leaders. This is how does. So let's bring it down to. There's two questions I want to ask, and I'm not sure which one to ask first. So I'll give you both, and you choose. I'm imagining a leader listening to this, thinking about their constraints. Oh boy, these things I'm up against. But then also, I'm thinking of a leader who's on either end of this spectrum. The two questions are, what are the constraints that you see? From your experience, what are some common things that you see that we get in our own way? And the second question was, how can we, as a leader, and I'm excited about this, what are some simple things? So if I could choose which one you want to start with.
Here's a controversial point. I'm going to assume the camera's not running, right?
It isn't.
One of the problems that I think in this journey is, let's say you take a company that's been doing hammers for years and years, and they figured out their brand team and their engineers, and everybody on the team has figured, the whole team is lined up to do pliers now. The problem is nobody in the executive level has ever run a plier business. And so one of the things that we tend to think we can do is retool somebody that knows how to do hammers into a plier leader.
They're just tooled, so they don't go here.
They don't go here, and what they bring with them is all their orthodoxy and biases and accepted beliefs around a hammer business to
that
the plier
doesn't
business.
honor the culture of that business.
That business, capabilities needed, it's the whole thing.
Okay.
And it's not, and that's a broad brush. Now you can take hammer people and teach them how to do pliers. At my old company, you could teach a soap person how to go do paper towels.
But it's work. It's awareness.
It's awareness. And the reason that could work is the deep institutional memory around how to do paper towels. So you could take somebody out of soap, put them into paper towels, and there's
So it's an exercise of reframing for them.
But the company has never done pliers. And you don't have anybody in the company that's ever done pliers. You got to think about whether or not you got a leader in there that can actually run that business with authority and credibility and be able to make the calls when they have to get called. Because man, making pliers is a lot different than making hammers.
And get down to this clarity in decision making. So so the culture picks up on, if I urge you, that this person knows what they're talking about.
There's a confidence that comes with it, makes sense. Or I'm not sure it makes sense to me yet, but I can trust them that
there's a trust
that I
factor
will.
in it.
And it's credible. And because doing this kind of work requires there's a lot of floor burns and bruises that come into anything, right? And so it's not having. You asked me what a constraint is, and it's sort of the excited and ambitious company that wants to go. They do hammers, they want to do pliers now, but they don't know how to do pliers. And it's, I guess, to use this terminology, it's the unconscious incompetence.
Right.
It's the things you don't know that you don't know.
It's the shiny object syndrome.
Oh, that too. Right. So let's get after it.
Let's go do this because someone's doing it.
Someone's doing it. And you start to break down. It's like you didn't, for example, you didn't anticipate how.
So this takes off and breaks this barrier and doesn't honor the tension that's here.
Yes.
We just got excited about
Well, here's
it.
the consequence.
It becomes a distraction.
It's not just the failure of, we're going to go do pliers now, and everybody's excited. Let's all go do pliers. And it's hard.
Yeah.
And it's like we're making mistakes. And we didn't see that coming. And all of a sudden it's like, we're not going to do that again.
Well, it comes back to, you said this word trust. How does trust play in this? I mean, how does trust play into what you've been talking about?
Well, trust on a whole lot of levels, right? I mean, and you know a lot about this, but do you trust your leadership? Do you trust your peers? Do you trust your processes, to use do you trust, and it goes into things like decision making again, and if I come with an issue, how's my leadership going to respond? It's the way leadership responds. So,
like, what about the journey? What about trust in the journey?
Well, it's people. Well, there's two parts of the way. You might get trust at the beginning, and you can even tell them how it's going to go. But if they still haven't seen that ordeal, and then when it comes, that frustration, that agitation, that failure mode, that thing that didn't work out, is they don't know how to pivot.
Interesting.
Right, and so there's whether it could be panic, it could be defeat,
right?
It could be, we tried that, we're not going to do that again. Right, so there's just something that's so important. Trust will get you started. I guess it's interesting. The trust needs to be there when things go wrong.
Well, that's right. But this ability to pivot,
right,
and to be ready for that,
because things will go wrong. And that's why, again,
things will go wrong.
Things will go wrong, right? And but again, back to this: how do you elicit those as early as you can, at the lowest resolution possible?
Right.
And I keep going back to this thing over here, but do you know your who, your value prop, business model, and your right to win? And always be asking these questions. What are your assumptions and your failure modes? And to pay attention to whether or not you're really answering those questions. But all that being said, this is all process. You asked me about leadership earlier and listening, and I said it's discernment, and in order to have discernment, you have to have people that have done pliers before. I mean, at some point you can't generalize, unless the organization's got a deep institutional memory in pliers. There's plenty of things around to remind you, but it's just what you know or don't know, and familiarity.
So around this simplicity of how you've described this, what else would you add to this?
Well, thanks for saying this is simple. It is simpler, I think, than it looks. But I think, I think that is the thing that is so important in this work, is always to strive to make it simple, but don't lose the meaning in the process. Simple doesn't mean easy. It means It's clear. And so, again, that's one of the things that I've been concerned about with all, the emerging best practices. Lots of smart people. This is not a comment on all the smart people that are pushing stuff out on LinkedIn, for example.
Right.
It's that what that's done is it's sort of muddied the water. And I think what I would say is, to make it clear, always be focusing on what you have to answer, not how you're going to answer it. There's one more thought too, and you and I talked about this earlier, and it sort of has to do with a force and a trend that's, I think, been emerging partly as an artifact of design thinking, which I'm a big fan of, but is the emphasis on collaborative work processes, group work process, community innovation. Totally agree with all that. I mean, it's great stuff. Leverage the crowd, the wisdom of the people. But I had a mentor in college give me this advice once, a guy named Gilborn down at the University of Cincinnati, and he said, every great idea has to form in the mind of one person. Ultimately, a person needs to put things together in a way that they haven't been put before. There's a leap that happens. Connections, reframes. Somebody's taking all the stimulus from a group and seeing something differently. It doesn't simultaneously happen in a room of 10 people. It's in the mind.
Do you think that's a moment? Is that a moment of ownership of the? It's not like I have to make a decision on this, but all of a sudden everybody's striving to kind of own the moment of the whole thing.
I think that's part of it. You take it on, like we talked, make it your own, and applying whatever nuanced, soft, hard perspective you got on something. And sometimes you don't know how you got there, right? Because as an artist with your background, you know how that works. There's something that happened, and you push things together in a way that you hadn't done
I like
before.
what you said. Always know what you need to answer, not how.
But the reason I bring it up is I think that's the next phase of work. So if you think about what Deming did with work process and innovation, statistical process control, reducing things to processes and understanding how you do the work you do and how to do it better, always in continual improvement. And then social processes, like design thinking and other things like that, is a return to what the role of an individual is in an innovation process, and find a way to allow for individuals to participate in this process, even if, and that's one of the things back to code. The problem with code is, it's constraining, right? It could be inhibiting. But I guess as a leader is to understand that you've always got, and this is a systems model, that I think it's, individual, social, and work process. And in any situation, you have those three things going on, whether they're intentional or not. And how do we get intentional about the individual process in all of this? Because all those other things are important. Work process is important, group process is important, the culture is important. They're people, right? Individuals. Right. And what Dr. Bourne told me, I think was profound. It was like, somebody has to think of it, right? And if you don't allow for that to happen, you can,
well, that's the power of the human mind.
Right.
The power of you can't replace the human brain with a team. That individual human brain is when I hear you talk about that, that's the power engine we're really dealing with here.
Right.
How can the team feed the power brain of
right.
the individual?
Team elevates everybody.
Because it can do stuff we don't even know can do.
Right. So I like that model. That's a great model. So the idea is that the team elevates everybody on the team so that the step-off points for every individual in that team into a new place as individuals to bring back to the team.
So this is forcing these individuals up to then come
right
back into the team.
And there's a role that's played in this, and I think that's another nuance in all of this is like how do you asked about leaders, about how do teams show up with each other? How do leaders show up in the meetings? And what's the context? What's the situation? What's the story? What's going on? Not to the point where it's stifling, but more of a sensitivity around, how can I be helpful right now in this moment?
Okay.
Right. So, as a leader,
So what's the basic message you would like to leave with leaders who are thinking about innovation?
I guess it's an emphasis on the really basic stuff, and to avoid sort of moving into all that murky space around tools and methodologies, but how do you simplify your thought process around value, intent, where things start, questions you got to answer, and then what must be true, why will it fail, all the way through the process. Socialize that process so everybody's involved in it.
Right, and it'll reward you.
Yeah, and then I don't know, I'm kind of rattling my simple message turning into a lot of bullet points. But then there's the role of the leader and knowing when to follow and contribute and when to help make decisions.
Very good. The idea of basics, what you're doing, clear, easy, simple, clear. It's keep it clear, not essentially easy, what to answer. And as a leader, take on some of these things around awareness, self-awareness, listening, the discernment, know when to make a decision.
Yeah, I'd say
because that brings clarity.
To boil it down even maybe further, is the questions ought to be so easy to understand, hard to answer, but you understand why you're asking that, right? And
especially if you're going to be doing this.
right,
If you're going out to people, people need to understand
right.
what you're basically asking. Any more final thoughts?
Nope, I think that's it for now, unless you got another whiteboard, but we can do that.
Thank you, Greg.
All right, Steve,
All right,
thank you.
thanks for tuning in. Greg Ames.
We hope you found value in what we have captured, and we look forward to seeing where you will take the conversation.